Michael Jordan was a man known all around the world for his success, his talent, and his inspiring story, yet behind the fame and fortune, he carried himself with the same humility that had guided him from his early days. He liked to live simply, he liked to walk into places without announcing who he was, and he often dressed in casual clothes that made him blend in with everyone else. And on one warm afternoon he decided to visit a small town bank that he had recently acquired through one of his investments. Though no one at the branch knew yet that the new owner of the bank was him, he wanted to see how ordinary people were treated when they walked through the tall glass doors. He wanted to feel the experience as a customer, not as a celebrity, not as an icon, not as the name written in history books, but as a regular man with a piece of paper in his pocket. And so he entered quietly, wearing a plain shirt, a cap pulled down over his face, and simple jeans that carried no sign of wealth or power, and he waited patiently in line, holding a check that represented money he wanted to deposit, money that was his, fair and square, money that could not be questioned. Yet he knew that sometimes people judged without knowing. They looked only at appearances and made decisions based on what their eyes told them instead of what the truth was. As he moved slowly to the front of the line, his mind was calm, and he thought of his mother, who always reminded him to treat everyone with kindness because kindness revealed more about a person than anything else, and he wanted to believe that the people working in this bank shared that value. He wanted to believe that they would treat him like any other man. But soon his quiet hope would meet an unexpected test. When he reached the desk, the bank manager, a man named Robert Kennedy, looked at him quickly, and the look carried a sharpness, a doubt, a cold measure that spoke louder than words, because Robert was a man who had worked in the bank for more than 20 years, a man who believed he could tell who was wealthy, who was struggling, who was trustworthy, and who was not, just by the way they walked in and handed a check across the counter. And when Michael placed his check gently on the desk and said softly that he wanted to deposit it, Robert's eyes narrowed, and he asked him questions that felt less like professional duty and more like suspicion, questions filled with disbelief, as if the piece of paper could not possibly belong to the man standing in front of him. Michael answered with calm patience, never raising his voice, never showing offense, because deep inside he knew this moment was revealing something greater than a simple transaction. It was showing the heart of the man behind the counter. It was showing the truth of how one human being could look at another and decide worth not by character, not by honesty, but by assumptions. And as the questions dragged on, Robert finally held the check up, staring at the name written on it, and instead of respecting it, instead of following the rules, instead of treating it like a legal financial document, he made a careless, reckless choice, a choice born out of arrogance, and with a dismissive laugh, he said that people like Michael should not be carrying such checks, that it looked suspicious, that it could not be real. And before Michael could respond, before reason could enter the room, Robert did something shocking, something that no bank manager should ever do. He reached for the corner of the check and, with a flicker of fire from the lighter he carried, he burned it right there at his desk, letting the flames curl through the paper, letting the smoke rise in the air as if he was proud of what he was doing, as if destroying a man's property could somehow prove his judgment right. And the people standing nearby gasped, customers in line whispered to each other, some in disbelief, some in discomfort, because they saw not only the check burning but the injustice of the act itself. And Michael, watching his check turn into ash, stood still, not with anger in his eyes but with a quiet strength, the kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are, from knowing that the truth cannot be erased by fire, from knowing that dignity cannot be taken away by arrogance. He did not shout, he did not fight, he simply looked at Robert, and in that long silence, Robert felt none of the shame he should have felt, for he believed he had done the right thing, but in reality, he had just written the first line of a story that would soon reveal the greatest irony of his career, because he had burned the check of the very man who owned the building he worked in, the very man who paid the salaries of the staff, the very man who had walked in not to show power, not to show fame, but to test kindness and respect. And though part 1 of this story ends with the ashes of that check lying on the polished desk, it also begins with the rising of a lesson that everyone in that bank would never forget, a lesson about judgment, humility, and the truth that appearances can deceive while respect should never be denied. The ashes of the burned check still rested on the polished desk, and though the smell of smoke had already faded into the air of the bank, the memory of what had just happened stayed heavy in the room, with every eye fixed on the man who stood silently watching, for Michael Jordan did not rush to speak, he did not raise his voice, he did not demand attention, he simply breathed slowly as though time itself had slowed down, and that quiet composure unsettled Robert Kennedy far more than any anger could have, because anger he expected, shouting he could dismiss, but silence carried a weight that pressed against his pride, yet instead of stepping back, instead of realizing the mistake, Robert leaned on his chair with arrogance, tapping the table as if he had proven himself right, saying in a cold voice that the bank could not be fooled, that people could not walk in with suspicious papers and expect to be taken seriously, and the staff behind him glanced nervously at each other. Sensing the cruelty of his tone, sensing that the man in front of them deserved respect, and yet no one dared to speak because Robert had long ruled the branch with a hard hand, treating his position as power rather than service, and his word had always gone unquestioned, but on this day, that power was slipping from his hands without him realizing it, for the man he had insulted was not only wealthy but also the new owner of the very institution Robert thought he controlled, and soon the truth would shine brighter than the flame he had used to burn the check. Michael finally lifted his eyes and looked at Robert, not with anger but with calm strength, and his words were steady as he asked softly if destroying a customer's property was part of the bank's duty, if judging a man before knowing the facts was what the bank was proud of, and though his tone was calm, each word pierced the room with truth, making customers murmur among themselves, and Robert, instead of hearing the weight of the question, scoffed and told Michael to leave, saying that the bank did not need troublemakers, but even as he said it, a wave of discomfort swept through the lobby, because the people watching knew they had seen something wrong, they had seen arrogance displayed openly, and they had seen a man treated unfairly without reason, and in those quiet whispers, a sense of support grew around Michael, strangers who had come for their own banking needs now watching carefully, waiting to see what would happen next, and though Michael could have spoken his identity in that moment, could have ended the game and revealed who he was, he chose not to, for he wanted to see the full measure of Robert's pride, he wanted to let the truth unfold at its own time, because lessons learned too quickly fade fast, but lessons revealed slowly strike deeper, and so he stepped back from the counter, nodded gently, and said nothing more, leaving the ashes of his check behind, but carrying with him the eyes of every person in the room, eyes that followed him out of the bank with curiosity and respect, for they sensed there was more to the man than what appeared, and Robert, though trying to dismiss the matter, felt a strange unease in his chest, as if the silence had planted a seed of doubt in his confidence. Later that evening, when the staff gathered in the break room, they spoke in low voices about what had happened, some saying it was unfair, some saying it was reckless, others wondering if the man would return with a complaint, but no one dared to bring the matter directly to Robert, for they knew how quickly his temper rose, and so the incident remained an unspoken shadow in the branch. Yet outside those walls, Michael walked calmly to his car, his mind thoughtful, because he was not angry, he was not humiliated, he was reflective, thinking of all the people who came into that bank daily, people without fame, without fortune, people who might face the same cold eyes, the same dismissive tone, the same arrogance, and he realized that what he had seen was not only his story but their story too, and that was the reason he had chosen to stay quiet for now, to let Robert live one more day in his false pride, because the moment of truth, when it came, would not only shake Robert but teach everyone in that building the true meaning of respect. And so as the sun set that day, Michael decided that the next step would come not from confrontation but from patience, for sometimes patience is the sharpest tool, sharper than fire, sharper than pride, because patience exposes truth in a way that nothing else can. And in the quiet of his home that night, as he looked at the city lights through the window, he thought of the faces in the bank, the whispers of the customers, the nervous glances of the staff, and he knew the story was only beginning, a story not of revenge but of revelation, not of anger but of justice. And while Robert Kennedy slept soundly that night believing he had done his job, the world around him was slowly preparing to show him that arrogance always meets its mirror, and when it does, the reflection can never be denied. The morning after the incident at the bank arrived with clear skies, but the calm weather outside did not match the quiet storm beginning to grow inside the small branch, for word of what had happened had already begun to spread among the local community, carried through whispered conversations in grocery stores, in barber shops, and even along sidewalks where neighbors greeted each other, because the customers who had witnessed the burning of the check could not keep silent about what they had seen. And though they did not know the true identity of the man who had been mistreated, they knew enough to feel uneasy, they knew enough to feel that something unjust had taken place. And by the time the clock struck 9 and the glass doors of the bank opened, an air of curiosity lingered in the lobby as people wondered if the stranger might return, while inside Robert Kennedy prepared himself for another day with the same confidence he always carried, brushing off the memory of the event as though it meant nothing, convincing himself that he had done the right thing, telling himself that the man had probably disappeared, never to be seen again. But Robert did not know that Michael Jordan had not disappeared at all. He had simply stepped back to watch, to measure, and to plan, because he believed that true lessons took time to unfold, and this day would be the beginning of the real revelation. Michael sat in his office miles away, the large office that held his business files, his awards, and the paperwork that confirmed him as the new owner of the very bank branch Robert ran. And as he looked at the stack of reports on his desk, he thought of how strange life could be, how a man could sit in a chair of power yet choose arrogance over humility, forgetting that every position of leadership was truly a responsibility, not a throne. And as these thoughts filled his mind, he picked up his phone and made a quiet call to the regional director of the bank, a trusted figure who had worked with him closely in recent weeks, and he asked him to arrange a surprise visit to the branch, not with loud announcements, not with banners, but in silence, for he wanted the truth to reveal itself naturally. The director, though puzzled, agreed, and by noon arrangements were made for Michael to arrive in a few days with the senior board members, and in the meantime, Michael carried himself with patience, going about his other commitments, meeting people, smiling humbly, never hinting at the storm that was waiting to break inside that small branch. At the bank, Robert continued his routine, greeting certain customers with charm while offering cold stares to others he judged unworthy, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting, unaware that the man he had dismissed so carelessly was the very man who now held his future in his hands. And as the week moved on, tension grew among the staff, for the whispers of the incident had reached them too, and though they said nothing openly, many of them looked at their manager with new eyes, wondering if his arrogance might one day cost them their jobs, wondering if fairness was ever going to find a place in the walls of their workplace. And the silence between staff members carried a weight that Robert chose to ignore, Because pride often blinds a man to the warnings around him. Finally, the day of the visit arrived, and the sun shone brightly through the windows as Michael stepped out of a sleek car in front of the branch, this time not in casual clothes but in a neat suit that reflected dignity rather than extravagance, and beside him walked the regional director and 2 board members, all carrying quiet authority, and when the glass doors opened, the sound of their steps on the marble floor drew every eye in the lobby, including Robert's, who quickly adjusted his tie, his heart skipping for a moment as he recognized the importance of their presence, for never in his 20 years had the senior members arrived unannounced, and though he greeted them with forced confidence, his palms were damp with unease, and in that moment, Michael met his eyes, and Robert felt a sudden wave of recognition, the memory of the man with the check, the man he had dismissed, the man he had humiliated, standing now in front of him with authority greater than he could have imagined, and his voice trembled as he offered a greeting, while Michael's response was calm, steady, and respectful, yet behind that calmness lay the power of truth waiting to be spoken. The customers inside, sensing that something important was about to happen, fell silent, their conversations fading into whispers as they leaned closer, and the staff gathered nervously near the counters, unsure of what was unfolding, until finally the regional director cleared his throat and announced to everyone that the new owner of the bank was here, the man who had chosen to keep his identity private until now, the man who believed in fairness and dignity, and when the name Michael Jordan was spoken, the room fell into stunned silence, gasps of disbelief filling the air as all eyes turned to Robert, who stood frozen in place, his face pale, his pride crumbling in front of everyone, because the man whose check he had burned, the man he had mocked, was the very owner of the building, the very man who now controlled his future. Michael did not gloat, he did not boast, he simply stood with the quiet strength that had carried him all his life, and in his calm voice, he began to speak not only to Robert but to everyone present, saying that a bank was not just about money, it was about trust, it was about service, it was about treating every customer with dignity no matter who they were, no matter how they looked, no matter what they carried in their hands, because behind every check was a person, and behind every person was a story, and as his words flowed, the people in the lobby listened with respect, for they knew they were hearing not a lecture but a truth spoken from the heart, and though Robert stood with his head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of his new employer, the lesson he had refused to learn before was now standing before him in full light, undeniable, unforgettable, and unchangeable, marking the beginning of a transformation that would test not only his pride but his entire future in the world of the bank. The silence in the bank after the revelation of Michael Jordan's ownership was so heavy that even the ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual, and while customers whispered among themselves with surprise, the staff stood frozen in a mixture of awe and fear, for they had just learned that the man they had seen treated unfairly was in fact the very leader of the institution they worked for, and all eyes shifted toward Robert Kennedy, who stood stiff and pale, his earlier arrogance now melting into quiet panic, because he knew in that moment that every careless word he had spoken, every doubt he had cast, and every action he had taken against the stranger was now echoing back at him with a force too great to deny. Yet Michael did not raise his voice, he did not humiliate Robert in front of everyone, instead he remained calm, his expression serious but not cruel, and in that calmness there was a power far stronger than anger, for it showed control, it showed discipline, it showed dignity, and his voice carried through the lobby as he spoke about respect, reminding everyone that a bank was not just a place for money but a place of trust, where people came with their hopes, their savings, their dreams written on pieces of paper, and those papers, whether small or large, whether carrying $10 or 10 million, deserved the same care because behind them stood human lives. His words, though spoken softly, cut through the pride of Robert, who lowered his eyes to the floor, wishing he could undo the moment when he lit that flame, but the truth was now carved into memory, and there was no way to erase it. Michael then turned to the customers who had been watching with concern and thanked them for their patience, assuring them that fairness would always be the foundation of the bank going forward, and he promised that every person, no matter their background or appearance, would be treated with dignity, and his sincerity brought nods from the crowd, some even smiling with relief, for they felt that change had truly stepped into the room. After speaking to the customers, Michael looked back at the staff, reminding them that leadership was not about fear but about service, not about controlling others but about guiding them with honesty, and he told them that their work was valuable, their role important, and their duty sacred, because trust once broken was hard to rebuild, but trust nurtured could last for generations. The employees, many of whom had silently endured Robert's harsh leadership for years, felt a spark of hope rise in their hearts as they listened, for they realized that the man standing before them was not only a figure of success but also a man of values, a leader who believed in fairness, and they saw in his eyes the kind of strength that comes from humility rather than pride. Robert, however, felt the weight of the room pressing on him, for he knew that his time of control was ending, and though his lips tried to form words of apology, they fell short, his voice trembling as he muttered regrets that sounded small compared to the harm done, and Michael listened quietly, nodding once but making no promises, for forgiveness was not something to be given lightly, it was something that needed time, proof, and true change. The regional director then stepped forward, reminding everyone that this day would be remembered not for the mistake but for the lesson, and he assured them that the bank's leadership under Michael would focus on rebuilding trust with every customer, and the staff applauded softly, not because they were forced to but because they felt the sincerity in his words. Michael then excused himself from the crowd, asking Robert to follow him into the manager's office, and the two men entered the quiet room where the smell of burned paper seemed still to linger, a reminder of the careless act that had started it all. Michael sat down calmly, while Robert remained standing, nervous, his hands shaking as he tried to explain himself, saying that he had only been trying to protect the bank, that he had made a mistake in judgment, that he had acted too quickly, but his words sounded hollow in the stillness of the room, for both men knew that his choice had not been about protection but about pride, about prejudice, about the arrogance of assuming who someone was based only on how they appeared, and Michael let him finish before speaking softly, saying that leadership was measured not in years served but in moments of truth, and in that moment, Robert had failed, because he had chosen arrogance over respect, assumption over fairness, fire over patience, and that choice had consequences. Robert's eyes filled with fear as he asked if he was going to lose his position, if his years of service meant nothing, and Michael, with the calm wisdom that had carried him through victories and failures in his life, replied that years of service were valuable only if they taught humility, that mistakes were forgivable only if they opened the door to change, and that leadership could not be built on fear. But he did not give a final answer yet, for he wanted Robert to sit with the weight of his actions, to understand that the path ahead would be decided not by excuses but by the truth of his future conduct. Outside the office, the staff and customers waited, their hearts heavy with curiosity, while inside, Robert lowered his head, knowing that the power he once held was gone, replaced by a test of character he had never faced before, and as Michael rose from his chair and prepared to leave, he told Robert that time would reveal if he could truly change, if he could learn the lesson written not in books but in ashes, and with those words, Michael stepped out of the office, his presence filling the lobby once more, and as he shook hands with the customers and staff, he carried himself not as a man demanding respect but as a man showing it, and in that moment, The bank itself felt transformed, not by wealth, not by ownership, but by dignity, leaving everyone in the room with a sense that they had witnessed something far greater than a business transaction. They had witnessed the quiet strength of humility standing against the loud weakness of pride. The days that followed the revelation at the bank carried a different air than before, for the branch that had once been ruled by fear and cold judgment now began to feel lighter, as though a window had been opened to let fresh air sweep through, and customers who had long felt uneasy when dealing with Robert Kennedy now walked through the glass doors with more confidence, because they had seen with their own eyes that fairness had finally found its place, and the staff, who had once whispered in the break room about their manager's arrogance, now spoke more openly about the hope they felt, for Michael Jordan's visit had shown them that leadership could be kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, and that truth could stand tall without raising its voice. Robert himself lived those days in deep reflection, for the humiliation of seeing his pride crumble in front of customers and employees had shaken him to his core, and he spent long hours alone in his office staring at the desk where he had once burned a man's check, realizing that the ashes were no longer just paper but a symbol of his own downfall, yet also a chance for his rebirth if he was willing to learn. He walked into the branch each morning quieter than before, no longer carrying himself with the same swagger, no longer speaking to the staff with the sharpness that had once marked his tone, for he had learned through the most painful way that respect once lost was hard to earn back, and every smile he forced, every apology he whispered, was only the beginning of a long journey he had to travel. Michael, though busy with his many responsibilities, kept a close eye on the branch through reports and updates, not out of anger but out of care, because he believed that leadership meant giving people the chance to change, and while he could have easily dismissed Robert that very day, he had chosen a different path, a path of patience, because sometimes the greatest victories are not in removing a man but in transforming him, and Michael wanted to see if Robert could truly change. Weeks passed, and slowly, the staff noticed subtle differences in their manager, for Robert began to greet them in the mornings, something he had rarely done before. He began to listen when they spoke instead of dismissing their words, and he even surprised them by helping with small tasks that once he would have considered beneath him, and though the change was not instant and not perfect, it was real enough to spark cautious hope among those who worked beside him, for they realized that perhaps the lesson had finally reached his heart. Customers too began to notice the difference, for Robert no longer judged by appearances, he no longer narrowed his eyes at people who walked in with simple clothes. Instead he treated them with more patience, more professionalism, and though his voice still carried hesitation at times, he tried, and in that effort lay the proof that pride had been humbled. Michael returned to the branch a month later, not with a large entourage this time but alone, walking in quietly as he had done on the first day, and though the memory of the burned check still lingered in the air, the atmosphere was different now, warmer, more welcoming, and as he stood in line like an ordinary customer once again, he noticed how the staff treated everyone kindly, how the customers felt relaxed, and he smiled softly, for he saw that his lesson had taken root. When his turn came, Robert himself stood behind the counter, and though his hands trembled slightly, he greeted Michael respectfully, his voice steady but humble, and when Michael placed another check on the desk, this time Robert handled it with the utmost care, examining it properly, following the rules, and processing it without a trace of arrogance, and when he handed Michael the receipt, his eyes met his employer's with sincerity, and he spoke a quiet apology, not the kind filled with excuses but the kind that carried truth, saying he had been wrong, saying he had judged unfairly, saying he had let his pride blind him, and Michael, seeing the honesty in his words, nodded gently and told him that mistakes could break a man or they could build him, and it was his choice which path to walk, and with that, He left the bank as quietly as he had entered, his heart calm, for he knew the story had come full circle. In the weeks and months that followed, the branch became known in the town not for the incident of the burned check but for the transformation that followed, a story people told each other as a reminder that dignity and humility could turn even the hardest hearts, and Robert, though never fully free from the memory of his mistake, carried it with him as a lesson, shaping his actions each day, determined never to repeat it again. And Michael, continuing with his many ventures and responsibilities, carried with him the quiet satisfaction that he had chosen patience over punishment, humility over pride, and teaching over revenge, for he believed that real leadership was not about showing power but about inspiring change. And in the end, the story of the burned check was no longer about humiliation or arrogance, but about the strength of forgiveness, the possibility of transformation, and the enduring truth that respect is the richest wealth a man can ever give or receive.